Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellbite here, bringing you another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk a little bit more about that mid lane AD carry that Riot specifically called attention to in their most recent champion roadmap, and essentially my concerns with what a mid lane AD carry means for the game. Now, yes, marksmen have been playable in the mid lane for some time now, and so I'm not really contesting the viability of a marksman being played mid lane. Essentially, that's not really my concern. However, I do have some problems with Riot specifically designing a marksman for the mid lane and how this sort of box-checking design that they've been doing of late could have adverse impacts on the game. Now, first and foremost, I feel like there's no reason why a mid lane marksman is desirable or even preferable. I feel like marksmen have been more than playable in the mid lane for years now, even in the current metagame. Lucian and Tristana are two of the most preeminent mid laners in the game, and they're both AD carries, so it kind of doesn't make much sense for Riot to specifically say, oh, well, we need to design a mid lane AD carry because AD carries aren't being played mid lane. They can and totally are, right? So the question then becomes, okay, why specifically do we need one designed for it? Like, yeah, sure, we may not have an AD carry that is specifically being designed for that position, but either way, as long as they're still playable, doesn't that make sense? Doesn't that work just as well as anything else, right? It sort of doesn't make any sense to say, well, we don't have one specifically designed for it, therefore we need to change that, right? Like, okay, just because we don't have one designed for it doesn't mean it necessarily needs to be developed or needs to exist if it's still something that's currently playable. And also, this doesn't even include Corki. Corki is still totally playable as well. The other thing is, this also doesn't address the whole, marksmen are only playable bot lane argument. That's an argument that hasn't been true for years now, so it doesn't make any sense for people to be saying, oh, well, we need them because marksmen are only playable bot lane, so we absolutely have to then put an AD carry in the mid lane so we actually have options elsewhere, right? We've had AD carries designed for other positions before, or who have ended up being played in other positions. One can even think of someone like Graves, who totally sees play in the jungle. That's his preferred lane, as it is right now. Kindred, we're an AD carry designed specifically for the jungle. We have Senna, who is designed as an AD carry to be the support, which is sort of an odd thing when you really kind of think about it, but either way, that's the universe we live in. So it doesn't make any sense, therefore, for Riot to even be designing this champion as a mid lane AD carry, specifically for the ability to get AD carries playable in more than one position, right? That doesn't make any sense. We already have plenty of marksmen who are playable in other positions. So again, what sort of is the argument, what sort of is the reason behind creating a mid lane AD carry? Now, I do suppose this allows classes of champions besides marksmen to be played bot lane more readily, since the AD carry can take up the mantle of mid laner and you're able to play a mage bot lane without feeling like you're sort of wasting a spot and you don't have that consistent objective damage that you really need in a game of League of Legends. But that also implies that other classes are playable bot lane, which they kind of sort of aren't right now. Like, yes, mages have been played bot lane before. We've seen things like bruisers bot lane. We've seen tanks even with something like the fasting Senna strategy. But I would say that there's never been a metagame in which mages were a large percentage of the bot lane meta. I would say that if you look at the sort of professional League of Legends scene as a whole, which I think is a good example of, sort of looking at the metagame as a whole, looking at balance as a whole, we have never had a situation in which AD carries were playable, or in which AD carries were played in fewer than 90% of games. I would say in literally 90% or more games, you had at least one marksman in the bot lane, maybe two. And potentially, you even had more than that in other lanes, right? Like, even teams will sometimes field 2 to 3 marksmen depending on current champion preferences or current sort of, gameplay considerations or balance considerations, right? Like, they're always played. So it sort of raises the question then of, why do we need to open them up to other roles, when to me, it seems like they're doing totally fine where they currently are. And so essentially what this then boils down to me, if we sort of consider the fact that it doesn't make any sense for marksmen to be playable in more than their current positions, then it feels to me like this is an example of Riot trying to fit every class into every role and designing someone specifically for that role. And now Riot has done this before with champions like Senna and Pyke, and they almost always run into balancing issues with designing these specific champions to fill these specific roles. Riot's, I think, best designs have come from situations where they've designed a champion and they've said, okay, you know, we have been playtesting this champion. So a good example of this would be Vi, let's say. You know, we've playtested this champion, we've designed her, we think she's going to be played in the top lane, this is actually true. Vi was initially concepted as a top laner, right? Really thought she was going to be a good, solid top lane champion. But then she just didn't end up being played there. A lot of players tried taking her top lane, myself included, and didn't really see what Vi was doing that was better than the other top laners at the time, so it never really took off. However, players did experiment with her in the jungle and realize, wow, this champ is actually really, really good in the jungle. And essentially, from then on out, because of her strength in the jungle and because she was good in the jungle, Riot were really kind of able to say, okay, sure, we'll try to bounce her around the jungle from here on out because it seems like that's where she's getting played mostly, and it seems like that's where players are enjoying playing her. That kind of design works because it's an example of Riot looking at a champion design and just trying to make a holistic champion kit, and then essentially going from there, saying, okay, we've designed this champion, the champion kit works well, where is this champion going to be played? Well, we'll find out with the community. Sometimes they're able to kind of call it in advance. Tahm Kench was another top laner that ended up being a support because they realized Devour was just way too good in the ally case. But either way, this kind of champion kit allows things to sort of be developed naturally and in a way that works, in a way that players sort of understand and make sense. Conversely, when Riot say specifically, we are going to design a support who can be played, or an assassin who can be played as a support, or a Senna, we want her to be a marksman, but also we want her to be a support, so we're going to make this happen, you end up with designs that tend to be less sustainable in the long run, because these designs essentially by default are trying to add certain tools to a role or a class of champions that aren't necessarily very sustainable, right? Like if you really kind of think about the kinds of attributes that an AD carry brings to the table, or the kind of attributes that an assassin brings to the table, you kind of sort of understand why those champions aren't historically played in those classes or in those roles, right? Because an assassin by default doesn't have a lot of utility, right? That's kind of their whole shtick. Their whole shtick is all of the damage, all of the time, blow somebody up. And support has meanwhile been all about the utility. You don't need gold. The whole point is you're playing a champion that can do work and do its job without actually needing any degree of significant income. So in that regard, it's sort of like trying to put the square peg in the round hole. It doesn't make a lot of sense to try and force that, and when Riot have tried to force it, they've ended up with champions that have been very difficult to balance, shall we say. I think both Pyke and Senna they're the two most recent examples, so I'm harping on them the most, but they've done this before with previous champions. These are champions that have ended up in situations where they've enabled some very degenerate strategies, or the champion themselves has been very sort of difficult to balance around because of the unique attributes they bring. Pyke, for example, has been nerfed down repeatedly to get him out of solo lanes, where his free income coupled with farming has allowed him to gain way more gold than is healthy, and his inability to be poked down lets him sort of occupy a solid position in the mid lane. Senna, meanwhile, is the kind of champion that just gets to get gold for existing and playing a minigame that's also giving her stats, which then means that Senna is allowed to sort of double up on things like the gold gen items in addition to playing her sole minigame, in order to not really miss out on any gold. So she's allowed to give all the gold to a tank, let's say, that she can support fairly effectively, and then still transition into the late game AD carry, hyper-scaling champion that, AD carries are supposed to be. That is a problem, right? That's sort of a difficult to balance situation because you're giving, attributes to these champions or playstyles to these champions that essentially on their whole are not really that balanceable. It also means that the champion designs in general are slightly less elegant. I would say that a lot of champions, even if they don't have a super solid, combo, at least they have very obvious abilities that combo well together. Even something as simple as Viego being able to, use his E to get in close to you and then quick tap W you, right? That's kind of sort of a combo. It's not a combo, but you kind of get how those abilities work together, whereas Senna doesn't really have that, right? Even landing a root into her Q while her Q's targeted, you're going to hit that anyways. So, it's sort of the case where Senna doesn't have a kit that makes a lot of sense from that standpoint. It doesn't have a kit that plays well together. It's just a kit with a variety of abilities that are all there because essentially Riot chose to add them. Right, even if you think about how they designed the champion, they specifically said, well, we want to call back Delusion with Piercing Darkness, and we haven't done a global ultimate in a while, so we're going to slap one of those on the kit. And, well, this is a support, so we need to do certain things to let her be a support. And, well, she's a support AD carry, so she needs to get gold, and she needs to get stats, so we're going to create this mini-game. There's a lot going on in the Senna's kit that isn't holistic, that it doesn't feel very well designed because she's trying to tick too many boxes all at the same time. And so, therefore, designing a marksman specifically to be mid lane, to kind of come full circle with this, is problematic because it sort of makes me wonder what exactly are you going to be doing with this champion, right? Why are you, what kind of assets is this champion going to have that will make them a good mid laner? And essentially, I think my biggest question is, why is this champion going to be different from the other AD carries that are currently playable mid lane, right? If Lucian is already able to sort of have a hybrid assassin build by being able to dash onto vulnerable mages and chunk them out, or be able to have the poke of a mage with his Q and W, or even be able to look at things like being able to scale into a traditional, AD carry hyperscaling build, right? Then what advantages does a marksman designed specifically for mid lane even need if Lucian is already doing all of these things, right? It sort of raises the case where if you're going to design a champion specifically to do these things, he's going to be even better at it than Lucian is, and that gives me cause for concern. And essentially, this gets into the concept of box checking, which I've hinted at a little bit, but this refers to designers doing things that they haven't been done just to say that they've done it. This isn't necessarily always a bad thing. Silas, I think, is an example of box checking. People have been wanting a champion that steals ults since the game came out almost, and so they designed a champion that steals ults, and he's settled down into a balanced state. But what it does mean is that the designs end up being less focused on what makes a good design and more about just ticking the box. That's why we got Senna, a support AD carry. Well, because, that doesn't exist, so add that. A support assassin in the form of Pike. Well, that doesn't exist, so add that. Now a mid lane marksman, which is funny because it does exist already in the form of Lucian and Corki, who arguably are played more there than in the bot lane, Corki especially, but Riot have not designed a champion specifically played as a marksman in the mid lane, so we have to design that. And those designs, like I said, they end up with all the sort of aforementioned issues for no other reason than, well, it doesn't exist yet and we want it to exist. It'd be the same thing as, considering an enchanter top laner. Why do we need to design that, right? Why does that exist? What interest does that bring to the game? Essentially, I would argue nothing other than novelty factor, being able to say, oh, well, it has to exist because we haven't done it quite yet. So now, this isn't necessarily always a bad thing. We have an enchanter support, or an enchanter jungler in the form of Ivern, who has been a relatively balanced champion, I would say, or champions like Silas, right, like I already mentioned. He's a box-checking champion that ends up working out. However, both of them did suffer through a period of being overtuned, so it kind of gets back to the situation where I just don't understand the big reason behind having these champions fit into these certain boxes, right? So either way, I think it's pointless to talk too much about the champion that doesn't exist quite yet. We don't know what sort of assets they're going to have or what sort of design he's going to have quite yet. But he could be totally worthless as a mid laner and ends up just going back to the bot lane like before. But I do think it's important to start this conversation now before Riot really start to approach these kinds of champion designs with more questionable motives, especially given that we're going to be getting more sort of characters that exist in the lore and Riot wanting to design the characters to be thematic foils with their opposite on the Rift or with their ally on the Rift. And that just leads to the kind of design that I'm talking about. But let me know what you guys think of any of this down in the comment section below, especially if you love the concept of mid lane marksman. Let me know why you like that down in the comments. I would love to hear your guys' thoughts. Honestly, I would, because I don't understand the draw, but if you think that's a cool design, let me know about that down in the comments. Like I said, I would love to hear about it. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.